They recycle food, fake wine, and deceive the elite. Keanu Reeves went undercover, and what he found is beyond belief. If you enjoyed this story, make sure to subscribe for more. Check out our other videos for more amazing content. And don't forget to share this video with your friends and write in the comments what city you were from. The hidden rot of Empire House. The rich never notice the people who clean up after them. They sip their aged scotch, twirl their silverware over artfully plated dishes, and discuss offshore accounts, luxury yachts, and private islands, all while an invisible army of workers moves around them, unseen and unheard. That's how places like Empire House operated, a world-class five-star restaurant nestled in the heart of Manhattan, where the wealthiest of the wealthy wined and dined, convinced that their experience was untouchable. The restaurant had a year-long waiting list, a dress code stricter than high society galas, and a price tag so outrageous that a single meal cost more than most people's mortgages. For years, it ran like a well-oiled machine. Until one janitor, a man they never even looked at twice, saw something he wasn't supposed to see. That janitor was Keanu Reeves. No one knew it was him. The disguise was flawless. Unkempt uniform, rough beard, a slouched posture that made him appear smaller, less significant. He had spent his life pretending to be other people for movies, but this was different. Keanu wasn't here for a role. He wasn't acting. He had embedded himself in the restaurant under a false name, taking the lowest job in the hierarchy, not for money or recognition, but for the truth. And within just a week, he realized something was deeply, deeply wrong. From the outside, Empire House was a temple of fine dining. Under the glow of crystal chandeliers, billionaires, politicians, and celebrities wined and dined, their laughter blending with the soft murmur of a live jazz quartet. Every surface gleamed, every dish arrived at the perfect temperature. The illusion of perfection was seamless. But behind the scenes, it was a house of horrors. The first thing Keanu noticed was the fear. The kitchen staff didn't work with pride. They worked like prisoners. Every movement was too fast, every reaction too sharp, as if one misstep would cost them more than their job. No one dared to speak above a whisper when the head chef entered the room. That chef was Victor Laurent, a culinary icon with Michelin stars to his name and a reputation that could make or break careers. The food world worshipped him, but Keanu saw the way the junior chefs flinched under his gaze, the way their hands trembled when plating his dishes. The real power, however, belonged to Eric Whitmore, the general manager. Eric didn't yell, didn't threaten, he didn't have to. His voice was always calm, too calm. A single glance from him carried an unspoken message. One wrong move, and you're done. Keanu watched, listened, waited. And then, one night, he saw it happen. It started with a single plate. A hedge fund CEO had ordered the most expensive item on the menu, a $600 dry-aged Wagyu filet, topped with black truffle shavings flown in from France. But when it reached his table, the man sent it back. Too cold, the server explained, setting the plate back on the counter. Victor scowled, but instead of preparing a fresh steak, he did something that made Keanu's stomach turn. He scraped off the truffles, threw the steak back on the grill for 20 seconds, then replated it with new garnish. The server hesitated. "Shouldn't we?" Victor's cold eyes locked onto him. "Take the plate, Matthew." The server swallowed hard, nodded, and carried the dish back out. Keanu clenched his fists. That wasn't a mistake. That was fraud. But that was just the beginning. Over the next few days, he noticed more. So much more. Expired ingredients being rebranded as fresh. Leftover steak shaved into a tartare and sold as a 5 Kobe. Cheap supermarket wine poured into luxury bottles. Dishwashers scrubbing plates clean of half-eaten meals, only for those meals to be reserved to unsuspecting guests. And worst of all, Everyone knew, the kitchen staff, the servers, even the dishwashers. But no one said a word, because Eric Whitmore did not tolerate questions. One night, while emptying the trash near the storage room, Keanu overheard something that made his blood run cold. Eric was talking to Victor, his voice as smooth as ever, but laced with something darker. "We can't keep cutting corners like this," Victor muttered. "If someone finds out, no one will find out," Eric interrupted, his tone sharp, "because no one is stupid enough to talk. You understand?" A pause. Then Victor exhaled. "Yeah, I understand." Keanu's stomach twisted. This wasn't just about food. This was about power. The kind of power that cut corners, lied, cheated, and walked away untouched. Keanu could have walked away that night. He could have finished his little experiment, gone back to his life, let someone else deal with it. But as he stood there, listening to Eric's voice echo in the dark, he knew, if no one else would stop them, he would. And he had just the plan to do it. Keanu had spent years embodying heroes on screen, rebels, warriors, men who fought against corruption. But this wasn't a script. This was real, and he was standing inside an empire built on deception. He gripped his phone tighter, standing in the dimly lit janitor's closet at Empire House, the weight of what he had just recorded pressing down on him. Conversations laced with threats, food manipulation schemes, money flowing into hidden accounts. He had it all, but exposing them wouldn't be easy. People like Eric Whitmore and Victor Laurent didn't just lose. They eliminated problems before they became threats, and right now, Keanu was a problem. He exhaled slowly, scrolling through his contacts. He needed someone who could blow this wide open, someone with reach, someone they couldn't silence. His finger hovered over a name, a journalist he trusted. But before he could press call, a sharp knock on the door made him freeze. "Kevin, you in there?" Keanu recognized the voice immediately. Lisa Martinez, one of the lead servers, a sharp-eyed woman who had worked in high-end restaurants long enough to see things others ignored. He cracked the door open, meeting her anxious gaze. "You really did it, didn't you?" she whispered, stepping inside and closing the door behind her. Keanu studied her face. Fear, admiration, and something else. Desperation. "Someone had to," he said quietly. Lisa exhaled, running a hand through her hair. "Whitmore's furious. He's been in his office for an hour, making calls nonstop. Victor, too. Whatever you said to them, it shook them." Keanu leaned against the wall. "Are you scared?" Lisa hesitated. Then she nodded. "Aren't you?" Keanu didn't answer. He already knew the truth. This wasn't just about expired food and phony wine. It was bigger, much bigger. The underground economy of rot. That night, Keanu decided to push deeper. If he was going to expose this, he needed to know just how rotten the system truly was. As his shift ended, he slipped past the main kitchen and into the storage corridor. The kitchen smelled of truffle oil, seared meats, and saffron. But beneath the luxurious aromas was something rancid, a smell that didn't belong. Keanu moved silently toward the back, past the dry-aging meat chambers, past the towering freezers labeled with Michelin-level ingredients. Then he found it, a separate storage room, locked, with a keypad entry. A minute later, he had the code. He didn't know who was stupid enough to write it on the back of a clipboard, but he was thankful for their laziness. The door clicked open. The first thing he saw was rows of sealed containers stacked from floor to ceiling. Keanu stepped closer, his stomach twisting. The labels read, "Reserve stock," but when he opened one, he recoiled. Inside, half-eaten filet mignon, scraped-off lobster tails, and discarded side dishes sat packed in vacuum-sealed bags, neatly labeled with dates. Food that had already been served to customers, repackaged to be served again. Keanu's jaw clenched. They weren't just cutting corners, they were feeding people garbage. At the back of the room, another shelf held bottles of wine, counterfeits, expensive labels, but inside, cheap house wine rebottled and marked up by thousands. He snapped photo after photo, capturing every detail. His pulse pounded. This isn't just a scam. This is organized fraud. Then a sound made him freeze. Footsteps. He quickly slid behind a shelf, pressing himself against the cold metal. The door opened and Victor Laurent stepped inside, his sharp eyes scanning the shelves. He pulled out a plastic-wrapped steak, turning it over in his hand. "This one's still good," he muttered, tossing it back onto the shelf. Another figure stepped inside, Eric Whitmore. Unlike Victor, Eric wasn't dressed in kitchen whites. He was always in a suit, always calculated. He walked straight to the wine rack, adjusting one of the counterfeit bottles. "We need to move some of these before the next inventory check," Eric said. "Start rotating them out, and keep the kitchen staff in line, especially the dishwashers. If any of them talk—" Victor cut in. "They won't. They're too scared to lose their jobs." Eric chuckled. "Good. Fear is useful." Keanu's fingers curled into fists. They knew exactly what they were doing. The two men continued speaking in hushed voices, but Keanu had heard enough. He had all the proof he needed. But as he shifted to move, his elbow clipped a metal canister, a soft clang echoing through the small room. The voices stopped instantly. "Who's there?" Keanu didn't breathe. Victor stepped forward, his eyes narrowing. He glanced around, checking between the shelves. Keanu could feel his pulse in his throat. If they caught him, if they saw who he really was, it wouldn't just be a firing, it would be something much worse. Victor turned toward the shelf where Keanu was hiding, his hand inches from pulling it open. Then a voice called from outside. "Chef, we need you on the line." Victor cursed under his breath, throwing one last glance around the room before turning back to Eric. "This conversation isn't over." Eric straightened his suit. "We'll deal with it later." The two men left. The door clicked shut. Keanu exhaled sharply, his body finally unfreezing. That was too close, but he had what he needed. Photos, evidence, recordings. This wasn't just about old food anymore. This was an empire of deception, and it was time to bring it down. Marco's voice was barely above a whisper, but the weight of it felt like a warning wrapped in desperation. "You need to walk away now, Reeves, before it's too late." Keanu didn't move. He had seen that look before, a man trapped in his own choices, justifying them because he saw no way out, but there was always a way out. "Not happening," Keanu said evenly, his voice firm, but calm. Marco clenched his jaw, exhaling sharply. He glanced toward the doors where James had disappeared. His loyalty was cracking, but fear was still holding him back. "Listen to me," Marco muttered, stepping closer, his voice low. "You don't know what kind of people you're dealing with. This isn't just about serving bad food or scamming rich people out of their money. This is bigger than that." Keanu didn't blink. "Then tell me how big." Marco hesitated, as if something inside him was battling against years of conditioned obedience. Then, finally, he spoke. "They're laundering money through this place," he admitted. "Millions of it. The food is just part of the cover. Expired ingredients, recycled dishes, that's small time compared to the real operation. Fake invoices, off-the-book suppliers, shipments that never arrive but get signed off anyway. This place isn't just a scam, it's a front." Keanu's stomach tightened. He had suspected corruption, but this was a whole different level. "Who's backing it?" Keanu pressed. Marco shook his head. "I don't know everyone at the top, but I know this. James isn't the one pulling the strings. He's just a middleman. The real people behind this, they make problems disappear." Before Keanu could push further, the kitchen doors swung open violently. James Calloway strode in, his sharp suit pristine, but his face dark with barely contained fury. "Marco, out," he ordered, not even glancing at him. Marco hesitated for half a second, then, with a final reluctant glance at Keanu, he slipped past James and disappeared into the kitchen. James turned to Keanu, his smile empty. his eyes cold. "I don't know what your game is, but let me explain something to you," James said, his voice smooth, controlled. "You are nothing but a janitor, and people like you don't belong in places like this." Keanu tilted his head slightly, his face unreadable. "People like me?" James's smirk widened. "The ones who clean up after men like me." Keanu let the words hang in the air for a moment before replying. "Funny," he said, his voice calm. "I was just thinking the same thing about you." James's jaw tightened. "You think you're smart? You think whatever little dirt you've gathered means something? Let me tell you how this works, Reed. People like me don't lose. We don't get exposed. We own the system, and if you make yourself a problem—" He leaned in slightly, his voice lowering to a dangerous whisper. "We erase problems." Keanu didn't move. "I think you overestimate how untouchable you are," he said evenly, "because the second I walk out of here, I have enough evidence to make sure you and this entire operation burn to the ground." James studied him for a long moment. Then he chuckled, shaking his head. "You really don't understand, do you?" he said, straightening his tie. "You think you've won something. But here's the reality. You're already dead. You just don't know it yet." James turned toward the kitchen doors, but before leaving, he added one final chilling remark. "You should say your goodbyes, Reed, because you won't be around long enough to use whatever you think you have." With that, he was gone. Keanu stood still, his heart pounding, not from fear, but from the sheer weight of what he had just confirmed. This wasn't just about a corrupt restaurant anymore. This was a criminal empire. The moment of truth. Keanu left the kitchen and stepped back into the dining area. The illusion of perfection continued around him. Crystal glasses clinking, waiters pouring counterfeit wine into overpriced goblets, customers oblivious to the filth lurking just behind the doors. Lisa was waiting near the host stand, her face pale. She had heard enough. "What did he say?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Keanu exhaled. "He told me I was already dead." Lisa swallowed hard. "Then what are we going to do?" Keanu glanced toward the exit, already formulating a plan. "We're going to expose them." Lisa looked around nervously. "You don't get it, Keanu. These people, they don't just ruin careers, they ruin lives." Keanu's eyes were sharp. "Then we make sure they don't get the chance." He pulled out his phone, scrolling through the evidence, recordings, photos, documents he had copied from the backroom files. He had enough to blow this operation wide open. Lisa hesitated, then finally nodded. "Okay, whatever you need, I'm in." Keanu looked at her, his respect for her growing. "Then, let's bring this place down." As they left Empire House, the weight of what they were about to do settled over them. They weren't just going up against a restaurant, they were challenging an empire. And empires didn't fall easily, but they always fell. The weight of James Calloway's threat hung heavy in the air. The restaurant buzzed with its usual display of extravagance, gold-rimmed plates, hushed laughter, the clinking of overpriced wine glasses. But behind the curtain, the reality was unraveling. Keanu Reeves had seen what lurked beneath the glitz and glamour, and now James knew that he knew. Keanu kept his expression neutral, but his mind was racing. He needed to act, fast. Marco had been shaken, Lisa was terrified, and James was calculating his next move. Keanu had hours, maybe minutes, before the noose tightened. As James turned and disappeared into the back, Keanu exhaled slowly. He had expected a fight, but what he didn't expect was how deep this corruption went. This wasn't just about cutting corners with food. It was about money laundering, organized fraud, and an entire system built on deceit. And now he had a target on his back. Lisa slipped through the side hallway, her face pale. "You have to get out of here. You don't understand. James has people, Real people. If he thinks you're a threat, he won't just fire you, he'll bury you. Keanu remained calm. I need time. Lisa hesitated before glancing around and slipping something into his pocket, a small flash drive. It's everything I could get from the system. Orders, fake invoices, supplier lists. It's all there, she whispered. If you go to the cops, you need proof. Keanu nodded. I won't let this slide. Lisa's eyes flicked toward the main entrance, where two unfamiliar men in black suits had just entered. Their eyes scanned the restaurant, landing on James, who tilted his head ever so slightly in Keanu's direction. Lisa's breath hitched. That's them, she murmured. You have to go. Now. But it was too late. A race against time. Keanu barely had time to react before one of the men stepped in front of him, blocking his path to the exit. Leaving so soon, Reed? The man asked, his voice cold. Keanu met his gaze with eerie calm. My shift's over. The second man approached from behind, close enough that Keanu could sense the real reason they were here. Boss wants to have a word, the first man continued, nodding toward the back office. Keanu weighed his options. If he fought them here, it would be a disaster. If he went with them, he'd be walking into a trap. Then, out of the corner of his eye, he spotted Marco. Marco stood just beyond the kitchen doors, watching. And for the first time, Keanu saw something in his expression. Hesitation. Marco had an opening to stop this, but would he take it? Keanu exhaled and gave a small nod, as if to say, not yet. Fine, he said, stepping forward. Lisa gasped softly as the men escorted Keanu toward the private VIP lounge, a room reserved for the restaurant's wealthiest clients and backdoor dealings. James Calloway was already seated at the head of the table, swirling a glass of vintage Bordeaux as he gestured toward the seat across from him. Sit. Keanu didn't move. Let's skip the theatrics. You want something? James smiled, but there was no warmth in it. I think we got off on the wrong foot, Reed. You're smart. I respect that, which is why I'm giving you a choice. He leaned forward. Walk away now. Delete whatever evidence you have, forget what you saw, and I'll make sure you leave here unharmed. Hell, I'll even throw in a severance package. You can move to another city, start fresh, no consequences. Keanu studied him. And if I don't? James's smile didn't fade. Then, I promise you, within 24 hours, you'll wish you had. Keanu met his gaze, unflinching. He could feel the tension in the room, the power James believed he had. People like you always think you're untouchable, Keanu said evenly. You think no one will ever call you out, that you'll always be protected. But what happens when someone decides they don't care about the consequences? James's fingers tightened around his glass, but his face remained impassive. Then they learned the hard way, he murmured. A test of loyalty. The office door opened suddenly. Marco stepped inside, his face unreadable. James barely acknowledged him. Tell our friend here what happens when people cross me. Marco didn't answer right away. Keanu knew this was it, the moment Marco had to choose a side. The tension stretched thin. Then Marco exhaled. I think you should let him walk, Marco said, his voice steady but quiet. James's expression darkened. Excuse me? Marco turned slightly, his gaze shifting between Keanu and James. You don't want the heat this will bring. Let him go. James set his glass down, his fingers drumming against the table. You're making a mistake, Marco. Marco's jaw tightened, but he didn't back down. Maybe. James exhaled slowly. Then he leaned back, nodding toward the two men in suits. Fine, let him go. For now. Keanu knew what that meant. This wasn't over. He walked past Marco, giving him the slightest nod of acknowledgement before heading toward the exit. Lisa was already waiting near the back, ready to slip out with him. As Keanu stepped outside, the cold night air hitting his face, he knew one thing for certain. James Calloway had just declared war. And Keanu Reeves. He was ready to fight back. James Calloway sat frozen in his chair, his knuckles white against the polished mahogany table. The prestigious Empire House, once an untouchable fortress of luxury dining, was crumbling around him, and for the first time, he had no way out. The health inspectors had found everything. The expired ingredients, the mislabeling of meats, the recycling of food from plates, the cheap substitutions disguised as premium products. It was all there in their official reports. The once immaculate restaurant now reeked of scandal, and James Calloway, the man who ran it all, had nowhere to hide. Keanu Reeves stood near the entrance, watching the empire collapse in real time. James's protests grew more desperate as the lead inspector, Eleanor Vaughn, remained unmoved. "You can't do this," James's voice cracked. "I have connections. You have no idea who you're dealing with." Eleanor barely glanced at him as she scribbled onto her clipboard. "What I know is that your connections didn't stop us from uncovering a blatant health violation in nearly every aspect of your operations. Your restaurant is officially closed until further notice." James shot up from his chair, his face red with fury, but his next words died in his throat when Eleanor handed him the formal closure notice. "Effective immediately," she said. "If you attempt to operate under another name, another license, we will make sure you're prosecuted." The kitchen staff, the servers, even the loyal employees who had turned a blind eye for years, all stood in silence, watching their once powerful boss fall apart. Lisa, standing near the bar, exchanged a glance with Keanu. The disbelief in her eyes was still fresh. They had actually done it. James ran a trembling hand through his hair. He wasn't processing it. He had never been the one without power. No, this isn't happening." His voice was quieter now, almost like he was speaking to himself. This was under control. This was under control. But it wasn't. This wasn't a temporary problem. It wasn't something he could cover up. This was the end. The final blow. Keanu watched James for a moment before stepping forward. He had one more thing to say. "You were never untouchable," Keanu said, his voice even, his words measured. "You just surrounded yourself with people too afraid to speak. That's over now." James's head snapped up, his bloodshot eyes narrowing. "You think you won." His voice was laced with venom, but there was something else underneath it. Panic. Keanu gave him a knowing look. "I wasn't trying to win." He gestured toward the inspectors packing up their reports, toward the staff who were realizing they no longer had to live in fear, toward Lisa, who had been ready to run before tonight but was now standing her ground. "I was trying to expose the truth." And that was what terrified James the most. The moment his dirty business practices were made public, the real people in power, the silent investors, the corrupt suppliers, the figures pulling the strings from behind closed doors, would turn on him to protect themselves. James wasn't just losing his restaurant, he was losing everything. The fallout. As the last of the inspectors filed out, James slumped back into his chair, his entire body defeated. His mind was already racing with the inevitable consequences. The phone calls from his connections would go unanswered. The press would have a field day. His investors would distance themselves. And the worst part? The kitchen staff, the people he had controlled with fear, would talk. Everything Keanu had uncovered would be confirmed by the very people James had terrorized for years. Lisa stepped up beside Keanu, watching James with a look of pure satisfaction. "I guess you should have treated your employees better," she said. James didn't respond. He couldn't. The walkout, Keanu turned to Marco, who had stayed silent during the entire ordeal. Marco's hands were clenched into fists, his jaw tight, his entire body braced as if he was waiting for James to lash out at him next. Keanu met his gaze. "You're free now." Marco exhaled, something between a sigh and a choked laugh. He looked around at the kitchen he had once dreamed of running, at the staff who had suffered under James's rule, at the destruction of everything he had been part of. Then, slowly, he nodded. "Yeah," his voice was hoarse. "I think we all are." With that, Keanu turned and walked out of Empire House. For the first time, he felt lighter. The air outside was crisp, the night alive with the buzz of the city. He had exposed corruption, helped bring down a system of deceit, and given the people who had been afraid to speak a voice. Lisa fell into step beside him. "So," she said, shoving her hands into her coat pockets. "What now?" Keanu smirked. "Now." He looked up at the skyline, at the towering buildings that housed more secrets, more corruption, more untouchable men like James. "Now, we find the next one." Keanu may have taken down Empire House, but this was just the beginning. The underground corruption of the luxury industry ran deeper than anyone imagined, and for every James Calloway, there was someone worse pulling the strings. Keanu wasn't done. He had exposed one lie. Now, he was going to expose them all. Keanu and Lisa stood on the dimly lit street corner, the scent of rain still lingering in the air from the earlier downpour. The black car had vanished, but the threat James Calloway left behind hung in the air like a toxic cloud. "You think he's bluffing?" Lisa asked, voice low. Keanu exhaled, watching the neon lights flicker across the pavement. "No," he admitted. "But bluff or not, he's out of moves. The problem is, whoever he's answering to isn't." Lisa's brow furrowed. "The investors?" Keanu nodded. "The people who kept Empire House running despite everything, the ones who knew exactly what James was doing and didn't care so long as the profits kept rolling in." He turned to her. "The restaurant was just one part of something bigger, and now that we've pulled the plug on it, they'll want to make sure the damage doesn't spread." Lisa swallowed. "And we're the damage." A silence stretched between them. Keanu could see the gears turning in her head, the weight of the situation sinking in. It wasn't just about exposing one corrupt restaurant anymore. They had kicked open a door they weren't meant to open, and now someone was going to make sure they paid for it. "I should go," Lisa finally said. Keanu turned to face her fully. "Where?" Lisa hesitated, crossing her arms. "I don't know. Somewhere. Anywhere but here." Keanu's jaw tightened. He understood the fear, the instinct to run, but he also knew that running wouldn't change anything. "If you disappear, they win," he said. Lisa let out a bitter laugh. "Keanu, I don't have your kind of protection. If these people come after me, I don't get a PR team or a Hollywood lawyer to clean it up." Keanu shook his head. "You think I have protection?" "Lisa, I'm standing in the same storm as you." She looked at him, something like frustration mixing with gratitude. "Then what do we do?" she asked. Keanu pulled out his phone, scrolling through his contacts. He stopped at one name, someone who could help, someone who had dealt with these kinds of people before. "We make sure this story doesn't die." The last call. Keanu sat on the edge of his motel bed, phone pressed to his ear. Lisa paced in the background, chewing on her thumbnail. The line rang twice before a voice answered. "I was wondering when you'd call." Keanu didn't waste time. "I need to make sure this gets out." A pause. "How deep does it go?" Keanu glanced at Lisa. "Deeper than we thought. Empire House was just the surface. The investors, whoever was backing James, are still out there." The voice on the other end sighed. "All right, get to a secure location. I'll pull some strings, but you need to disappear for a few days. If these people are as powerful as you say, they're already watching you." Keanu's grip tightened around the phone. "Yeah, I figured." The call ended. Keanu looked at Lisa. "Pack your stuff." She gave him a wary look. "Where are we going?" Keanu didn't answer right away. He thought about the investors, the hidden money, the secrets still buried under the polished facade of the luxury restaurant industry. To find out who's really pulling the strings. The hunter becomes the hunted. The next morning, Keanu and Lisa left the city under the cover of dawn. They took a rental car instead of Lisa's beaten-down sedan, used cash instead of credit cards, and drove without a destination. "Do you really think they'll come after us?" Lisa asked, gripping the steering wheel. Keanu glanced at the rearview mirror. A black sedan had been following them for the last 10 miles. "I think they already are." Lisa's knuckles turned white. Keanu sat back in his seat, mind racing. Empire House had been a test. Now it was a war, and he wasn't about to lose. Keanu leaned back slightly in his chair, eyes locked onto the mysterious man across from him. The dim lighting of the cafe cast long shadows across the table, the hum of conversation around them a quiet backdrop to the storm that was about to unfold. "You're saying I made myself a target." The man smirked, swirling his coffee before taking a slow sip. "No, Mr. Reeves, you were already a target the moment you stepped into Empire House. The only difference is, now they know your name." Keanu exhaled through his nose, his mind racing. He had walked into that restaurant expecting to expose a fraud, a corrupt kitchen cutting corners and endangering customers. He hadn't expected it to be this deep. "Who are they?" Keanu asked. The man set his cup down carefully, his expression unreadable. "You ever wonder why places like Empire House survive for so long? Why the same luxury restaurants that get caught using expired ingredients, laundering money, or dodging health inspections never seem to suffer? That's because they don't answer to the same rules as everyone else. They have protection, high places, deep pockets, people who don't just own restaurants, but own industries, finance, real estate, even politics." Keanu narrowed his eyes. So Calloway wasn't running the show. The man chuckled darkly. James Calloway? He was a pawn, a very well-paid, very obedient pawn, but a pawn nonetheless. His job was to make sure the money kept flowing, to keep the investors happy, and to make sure no one looked too closely at what was really happening behind closed doors. He leaned in, his voice lowering. "But you kicked the door open, and now they're going to make sure you regret it." Keanu's fingers drummed lightly against the table. He wasn't surprised. He'd felt it the moment Calloway had looked him in the eye outside the restaurant. The fear, the desperation. Someone bigger was pulling the strings, and now they were going to come looking for him. "So, what now?" Keanu asked. "I take it you didn't call me here just to warn me." The man nodded approvingly. "You're smart and careful. That's good. You're going to need both if you want to stay ahead of them." He reached into his pocket and slid a small USB drive across the table. "Everything you need to understand who's really behind Empire House is on there. Financial records, offshore accounts, ghost companies, things that don't just implicate Calloway, but the people above him." Keanu picked up the drive, turning it between his fingers. "And why are you giving this to me? What do you get out of it?" The man gave him a small, knowing smile. "Let's just say some of us are tired of seeing these people get away with everything. You have a rare advantage, Mr. Reeves. You're famous enough to be noticed, but not political enough to be controlled. You can get the truth out before they have a chance to bury it." Keanu studied the man, trying to decide if he was a friend, an informant, or something else entirely. But before he could press further, the man stood up, dropping a few bills on the table. "Keep your head down, Mr. Reeves. The people who backed Calloway, they're already watching you." Then, just like that, he was gone. The first shot. That night, Keanu sat in his hotel room, staring at his laptop screen. He plugged in the USB drive, his heart pounding as he opened the files. It was worse than he thought. There were offshore accounts linked to shell corporations that funneled millions through luxury restaurants, laundromats, and high-end casinos. Fake invoices, ghost employees, payments marked as supplies that never existed. But that wasn't even the worst part. One file stood out, a ledger of payments to inspectors, journalists, even law enforcement. Calloway hadn't just been covering up bad food, he had been buying silence. Keanu let out a slow breath. He had proof, more than enough to destroy these people. And that's when his phone buzzed. Unknown number. He hesitated for half a second before answering. Keanu Reeves, a voice greeted him smoothly. You're making a mistake. Keanu's grip on the phone tightened. Funny, I was about to say the same thing. A low chuckle. We gave you a chance to walk away. You should have taken it. Keanu stood, moving toward the window. Across the street, parked under a dimly lit street lamp, was a black SUV, watching him. You know what happens next, the voice continued. People like you don't get second warnings. Keanu exhaled, rolling his shoulders. And people like you don't scare me. A long pause. Then the line went dead. Keanu turned back to his laptop, staring at the files still open. They were right about one thing. There was no walking away now. The setup. The next morning, Keanu met Lisa at a coffee shop outside the city. You were followed, she said as he slid into the booth across from her. Keanu sipped his coffee. Yeah, I figured. Lisa leaned in. I did some digging on those accounts you sent me. Some of them tie back to politicians, but a few of them, they're linked to a company called Blackridge International. Keanu frowned. Never heard of them. You wouldn't, Lisa said. They don't advertise. No website, no board members listed, just a shadow company that consults for high-end businesses and governments. Keanu sat back. So Calloway wasn't just laundering money, he was moving it for someone else. Lisa nodded. And that someone doesn't want us looking any closer. Keanu rubbed his chin. Then we make them come to us. Lisa's eyebrows lifted. How? Keanu pulled out his phone and typed out a message. Subject: exclusive story. The truth behind Empire House and its real owners. Attaching files. Lisa's eyes widened. Wait, you're going public? Keanu smirked. Number I'm making them think I am. He hit send, not to a journalist, not to the press, but straight to one of Blackridge's executives. If they wanted to shut him up, they'd have to come to him. And when they did, he'd be ready. The trap is set. That night, Keanu sat in his car outside a vacant warehouse. The message had worked. A sleek black Mercedes pulled up across the lot, its headlights cutting through the darkness. Two men stepped out, sharp suits, no names. The cleanup crew. Keanu cracked his knuckles. They came to silence him. Too bad. They were the ones about to get exposed. Keanu stood on the bustling streets of New York, staring at the plain white card in his hand. No name, no logo, just a single number. A door had opened, one he could never close again. His mind raced. He had spent his life portraying heroes on screen, but this wasn't scripted. There was no stunt double, no controlled environment. This was real, and the stakes were far higher than he had ever imagined. His phone buzzed again. Lisa. You still thinking about making that call? Keanu smirked, glancing at the number on the card. I think we both know I don't have a choice anymore. Lisa hesitated before responding. Then you better be ready, because once you step into this, there's no turning back. Keanu inhaled deeply, then dialed the number. It rang twice before a familiar voice answered. I was hoping you'd call, Mr. Reeves, ready to see how deep this rabbit hole goes. Keanu clenched his jaw. I'm done waiting. Let's finish this. The meeting. An hour later, Keanu found himself stepping into a dimly lit underground bar in an abandoned part of the city. The kind of place where no questions were asked and no names were exchanged. The man from the cafe was already there, sitting in a booth at the back, a glass of whiskey untouched in front of him. Good to see you again, he said, gesturing for Keanu to sit. Keanu slid into the booth, eyes scanning the room. "I take it this isn't just about Calloway anymore." The man smirked. "Calloway was just a symptom. You saw it yourself. Recycled food, expired ingredients, money changing hands in the shadows. But the real disease, it's the system that allows it to thrive." He slid a folder across the table. Keanu opened it, his stomach tightening as he flipped through the documents. Offshore accounts, politicians, high-ranking corporate executives. This is bigger than just one corrupt restaurant, Mr. Reeves. This is an entire network, laundering money through fine dining, catering to clients who don't just buy overpriced meals, but favors, secrets, power. Keanu frowned. "And what do you expect me to do about it?" The man leaned forward, his voice low. "You already did step one. You exposed the rot. But now they're watching. And if you don't strike first, they'll make sure you never get another chance." Keanu set the folder down, exhaling sharply. "You want me to go after them?" The man smirked. "Not alone. We have people inside. Whistleblowers, former employees who want to talk but are too scared. You have the reach, the influence. If you push this into the light, they can't bury it." Keanu nodded slowly. "All right. What's the plan?" The man took a sip of his whiskey. "We start where it all began. Calloway's records, the shipments, the suppliers, the coded transactions. If we can trace where the money's coming from, we can follow it to the top." Keanu cracked his knuckles. "Then, let's get to work." Breaking into the system. That night, Keanu met Lisa in a small apartment she had been using as a safe house. Her laptop was open, screens glowing with lines of encrypted data. "I pulled every record I could find," Lisa said, gesturing to the monitor. "Shipments from Empire House. Their suppliers, half of them don't even exist. It's all a front for something bigger." Keanu leaned over, scanning the documents. His eyes locked onto a familiar name. "Blackridge International," he muttered. Lisa nodded. "Yeah, same company Calloway was connected to. They don't just supply food, they supply access. Private clubs, backroom deals, discreet services for high-paying clients." Keanu clenched his jaw. "We need proof, something undeniable." Lisa's fingers flew over the keyboard. "I might have something." She clicked a file, opening security footage from inside Empire House. The grainy video showed Calloway speaking to a man in a tailored suit, his face barely visible in the dim light. A shipment of special ingredients was being delivered. Not food, but cash, hidden inside crates labeled as imported truffles. Keanu's blood ran cold. This wasn't just about corrupt food practices. This was money laundering at a level that could take down an empire. Lisa looked up at him. "If we leak this, they'll come after us harder than before." Keanu didn't hesitate. "Then we make sure the whole world sees it before they get the chance." The drop Keanu and Lisa prepared the files, encrypting them, setting up a scheduled release. "Once we send this out," Lisa said, her voice tight, "we're burning every bridge. There's no coming back." Keanu nodded. "Then let's make sure it counts." He pressed send. Within minutes, journalists, law enforcement, and investigative watchdogs began receiving copies of the leaked documents. The walls of secrecy around Empire House, Blackridge International, and their hidden connections were about to come crashing down. Then the power went out. The apartment plunged into darkness. Lisa's breath hitched. "They're here!" Keanu grabbed her arm, pulling her toward the back exit just as footsteps thundered up the stairwell. "Move!" Keanu hissed. They barely made it into the alleyway before a black SUV screeched to a halt at the curb. Men in suits spilled out, weapons drawn. Lisa's voice was barely above a whisper. "They're not here to talk, are they?" Keanu's jaw tightened. "Number and neither are we." He grabbed a nearby trash lid, hurling it at the nearest man, sending him stumbling backward. Lisa sprinted ahead, yanking open the door to a parked car. "Get in." Keanu dove into the passenger seat as bullets shattered the windshield. Lisa floored the gas, the tires screeching as they sped off into the night. Nowhere left to hide. As they raced down the highway, Lisa gripped the wheel. "What do we do now?" she asked. Keanu checked his phone. The files had been received. "We wait," he said. "And when they come looking for us, we make sure they regret it." Lisa exhaled sharply. "This isn't just a restaurant scandal anymore, is it?" Keanu's eyes burned with determination. This is war." Keanu leaned back in his chair, watching the progress bar on his laptop inch forward. The files were massive. Bank statements, hidden ledgers, offshore transfers, all the dirty money Empire House had laundered through its overpriced plates of deception. The world was about to see it all. His finger hovered over the send button. "This is it," Lisa whispered beside him. Her face was pale, but her eyes burned with determination. "Once you press that, there's no undoing it." Keanu exhaled slowly. "That's the point." He clicked send. The email shot out into the digital void, reaching journalists, watchdog organizations, investigators, everyone who could turn this into a wildfire. Then the lights cut out. The apartment plunged into darkness. Lisa's breath hitched. "They found us!" Keanu grabbed her wrist. "Move!" A black SUV screeched to a halt outside, tires skidding against the pavement. Shadows shifted beyond the windows, armed figures closing in. Keanu yanked open the emergency fire escape door, shoving Lisa through it, just as the front door splintered inward. A masked figure entered, weapon raised. Keanu grabbed a chair, hurling it at the intruder. The man stumbled, cursing. Lisa was already scrambling down the fire escape. More gunmen poured into the apartment. Keanu grabbed the railing, swinging himself over just as bullets shredded the metal. They hit the alleyway hard, stumbling into the darkness. Engines revved. The SUV was coming around the corner. Lisa gasped. "We're trapped!" Keanu grabbed a nearby dumpster lid, slamming it against a fire exit door. Locked. The SUV skidded to a stop, doors flying open. James Calloway stepped out, flanked by 4 men in suits. He adjusted his cufflinks, eyes gleaming with fury. "You really thought it would be that easy, Reeves," he sneered. Keanu straightened, breathing hard. "No, I expected you to be just desperate enough to show up in person." James's smile wavered. Lisa slid her phone from her pocket, tapping a single button. A live video feed blinked to life. James's face appeared on every journalist's screen, every media network, every government watchdog, watching him in real time. His jaw clenched. The trap had been set. "This is checkmate, Calloway," Keanu said. James lunged forward, but the sound of sirens cut through the night. The alley flooded with red and blue lights. A fleet of FBI vehicles skidded onto the scene. Agents spilled out, weapons drawn. James stiffened. "You arrogant." "Hands up, Mr. Calloway," an agent barked. "We have a warrant for your arrest." James whirled on Keanu. His world was imploding. "You think this changes anything?" he hissed. "You don't even know how deep this goes." Keanu tilted his head. "I guess I'll find out soon enough." James's last act of defiance was silent. He straightened his suit, smoothed back his hair, and lifted his wrists. Click. The handcuffs snapped shut. The aftermath. By morning, every major news outlet was running the story. Empire House had collapsed overnight. Politicians, corporate moguls, backroom financiers, one by one, their names surfaced. Keanu and Lisa watched the headlines roll in from the safety of a remote safe house. Lisa exhaled. "We actually did it." Keanu chuckled. We just started it." Her smile faded. "What now?" Keanu took a sip of coffee, staring at the television screen. More names, more faces, more crimes. He set the mug down. "We go deeper." Lisa hesitated. "You're really not done?" Keanu's eyes darkened. Not even close. The war had just begun. The end, or just the beginning. Power and corruption thrive in the shadows, but truth has the power to bring them to light. Keanu's fight against deception in the luxury industry proves that standing up for what's right isn't just about personal victory, it's about dismantling systems built on lies. In today's world, greed often disguises itself behind prestige, but exposing the truth forces accountability. Never assume the wealthy or powerful act with integrity. Question, investigate, and demand transparency. Courage isn't the absence of fear, it's acting despite it. Change begins with those willing to challenge corruption, proving that integrity is the real currency of power. If you enjoy stories like this, don't forget to subscribe True Tapes channel, because tomorrow we have another special story for you.